So there are certain psychological principles that are common to friendship and enmity at the individual and collective levels, such as similarity. The role of similarity and dissimilarity is very important. As a general rule, the more the other is perceived to be similar, particularly on important criteria, then the more attractive they will be, the more likely it is we'll be friends with them. This works at the interpersonal level. In friendship and romantic relationships, we know that similarity is vital. It works at the international level. For example, relationships between nations are often very much influenced by cultural and linguistic similarities. Special relationships, such as the United States has with the UK, these are based on historic, cultural, and linguistic similarities. And of course, dissimilarity also plays a very important role. However, the traditional psychological approach is to present relationships as stable, and also to present personalities as stable. And we know that in reality, this is not the case. We know that friendships can become quite the opposite. People can become enemies with their former friends. This happens at the individual level and also at the collective level. For example, France and Germany are now very good allies within the European Union. They fought against each other in 2 world wars. The United States is very much a friend of Japan. The United States occupied Japan at the end of the Second World War and for years after. So these switches can take place at different levels. Processes of friendship and enmity are psychological because it is subjective. It is subjective perception of similarity and dissimilarity. That's where it is important to see, from your perspective, what importance do you give to certain criteria for similarity, dissimilarity? Again, if we take it at the interpersonal level first, Jane and John could fall in love having met through a friendship based on their love of 17th century Portuguese stamps. They could be dissimilar in other respects, such as politics, but their infatuation with 17th century Portuguese stamps could for them be the key similarity. It is subjective similarity that's important. In relationships, we often find that couples will avoid discussing certain topics because they know they are dissimilar on those topics. For example, couples who live together successfully, happily, for 40 years and never discuss politics avoid the topic because one of them is left-wing, the other is right-wing. Or they have dissimilarities in their religious beliefs. One of them goes to church, the other does not. Now, in order to live together successfully with that dissimilarity, they also have to have important similarities. So in their relationship, they will emphasize the similarities, avoid the dissimilarities as topics. Our ability to reframe the other, recategorize, and to use a larger in-group. But of course, the opposite can occur as well. When we create the other in the image of the dissimilar, the group that are not like us, They are different from us. And again, certain psychological processes kick in, some of them implicit. For example, the outgroup homogeneity effect. Oh, they're all the same, they're different from us. I can't tell one from the other. We're all different individuals, but they're just this mass of similar others. As soon as categorization takes place between us and them, two things usually happen. One is within group similarity is accentuated, and between group differences are accentuated. So we are all similar in the sense that we are us and we're the good people. There's a huge gulf between us and them, and they are a mass of homogeneous others. So these kinds of psychological processes kick in, and sometimes from that initial start, we get a process of what I call mutual radicalization, where each of us sees the other as different and also as an enemy. Mutual radicalization involves this process of increasingly taking radical steps and triggering increasing radical steps in the other group. During the Cold War, that was a major threat. The Soviets and the United States had fought together against the Nazis during the Second World War. And gradually, after the Second World War, we had this process of mutual radicalization. In recent times, Russia, that was a friend during the Gorbachev era, has suddenly become an enemy again, and we have this process of mutual radicalization with the United States and Russia taking increasingly radical steps against one another. Mutual radicalization is a process that can take over groups and push them to extreme positions. Becoming friends again requires a number of things. One of them is to have a superordinate goal, become a superordinate category. That is, to once again recognize the similarities and the common interests that we all have. To recognize that, for example, although there are different religions, all these different religions have commonalities. Although there are different cultures, there are many commonalities in these cultures. In order to focus on commonalities, what is common to human beings rather than what is different, we need to reevaluate the policies we are following, particularly in education. At the moment, the dominant policy for managing group differences is multiculturalism. Now, multiculturalism is the politically correct policy, but in my opinion, it is the wrong policy. Why? Because it is a policy that has encouraged groups to exaggerate and even manufacture differences between themselves and others, instead of focusing on what is common to all groups. So this is something we're going to have to work through, because many minority groups and religions particularly focus on multiculturalism as their savior. They believe that by celebrating differences, they are achieving their rights. But we have to keep in mind that the focus on differences is also leading to problems. And I believe it's actually detrimental to minority interests in the long term. Psychologically, we can link this back to identity. One of the most influential theories in psychology explaining identity is social identity theory. Social identity theory focuses on two universal motivations. One is that each of us, as a human, wants to be part of a group that is positively evaluated. Secondly, we also are motivated to belong to groups that are distinct, that are seen to be different. Now, that distinctiveness motive is very important. It's what pushes us to say to others, my religion is different. We are special. We are not like you. And this motivation often leads to the manufacturing and exaggeration of differences and the neglect of commonalities. So it's leading us to emphasize how we are different from everybody else and to neglect how we are, as human beings, similar to everyone else. I've proposed a policy of omniculturalism, omni being all, which focuses on human commonalities. And my conviction as a psychologist is that human beings have a great deal more in common than they have in terms of differences. They are more similar than dissimilar. But psychologically, we're often driven to focus on dissimilarity, particularly when we become enemies, particularly when we are in competition, either as individuals or as group members. Using superordinate categories, that is, categories that are beyond my religion, my nation, my group, my ethnicity, superordinate categories leads to better relationships. But there is so much in our 21st century world pushing us to differentiate, including our politicians, including the rhetoric of us and them, us against them. Psychologically, leaders know they can get more support from their group if they point to threats from the outgroup. As a general principle, we know that outgroup threats leads to in-group cohesion and stronger support for aggressive leadership. That mechanism, unfortunately, leads to some leaders misusing their position and focusing and exaggerating on threats, particularly threats from external groups. They are coming to get us. There's an invasion. Illegal immigrants. All these others who are nothing like us are coming to wipe out our culture. We are in danger. That kind of rhetoric leads to ethnocentric support for leadership. It leads to a surge in nationalism and rallying around the flag. So one of the challenges when we say we want to get people around their commonalities, how people are similar, to make them into stronger friendship groups. One of the challenges is that certain types of leadership will be opposed to us and they will be working against us. We evolved over millions of years in very small groups. And we learned to recognize and to use signals telling us that others are friends or enemies, and particularly telling us whether we can trust someone or not. We have research evidence showing that when participants in research are shown split-second images of a face, they can give ratings of how much they trust that face, how much they have confidence in that face, that kind of rating. And that rating will be a fairly good indicator of whether they would support that person in an election, whether that person would win in an election. Now, where do these implicit reactions come from? I believe they have evolved over very long time periods on the basis of our need to make split-second decisions about other people. If I'm walking on a field and I see you from 200 yards away, I don't know you, but I need to be able to tell from a split-second image of you and your face from a distance, I need to be able to tell whether I can trust you or not. Can I walk towards you, or should I start running? Now, that kind of split-second reaction to other people is still present in our everyday reactions today. For example, we know from interview research that first impressions matter. As soon as you see somebody, you often have an implicit reaction. I like this person. No, I don't like this person. So friendship is, I believe, very much associated with these implicit processes initially at first. Now, in some cases, initially we don't like somebody and we get to like them. But that initial reaction is very important. Why? Because often that initial reaction leads us to either interact with someone or not. We know that friendship is influenced by proximity, the number of interactions. So if I see you and my implicit reaction is, oh, this is somebody I like, I could get on with this person, I'm more likely to want to interact with you, to live next door to you, to be friends with you. But if my implicit reaction is, oh, this is somebody I can't trust, then I'm less likely to want to interact with you more. So a first step in friendship processes is really that initial reaction. And if you think about your own reactions in everyday life, often that first impression, that initial interaction, often the kinds of signals you get from someone that you can't even verbalize. You ask somebody, well, why don't you like so-and-so? And they say, well, I don't know. I don't know why I don't like them, but no, I don't like that person. I don't want to be in the party with that person. And they can't even verbalize it. The kind of friendship where there is high trust, the kind of friend where if you are in real trouble, you turn to that person. You won't have that many in life. There might be 2 or 3 if we're lucky. And in the modern context of social media, we use the friend label very loosely. You know, how many friends do you have on Facebook? Well, are they really friends? So the term friendship we've got to be very careful about in the traditional sense of a friend being a person who you trust, who you turn to when you are in trouble, who is dependable and who can depend on you, and who you would forgive if they did something terribly wrong. Those kinds of criteria, most people will only have one or two friends, perhaps three. Some psychologists would say that's not true. That is your explicit account. But underneath that, if we dig deeper, there are all kinds of other things going on. Imagine if you have a friend who you like in that way and say, oh, I really like this person. Imagine if you gave your friend a birthday present and it was a present that you really took a lot of trouble with. And the following year you gave your friend a birthday present and your friend never remembered your birthday and never gave you a present. After a few years, you might get fed up and you might say, hey, why aren't I getting a present? So some psychologists would say there is an aspect of reciprocity, and this is very important. However, it's also subjective. Equity theory would argue that there's always this subjective ratio that we have in our heads of how much we put into a relationship and how much we get out of it. Now, it's subjective, so I could exaggerate how much I get out of a relationship and minimize how much I put in. I could say, oh, I know I give a birthday present every year, but it really doesn't matter because my friend is always giving me good advice. So I could balance things out subjectively, but I still want something from that friend, even if it's just good advice or what I think is good advice. So equity theory would say we have a way of working this out subjectively to make it reciprocal, in our minds at least. Training in schools is a great idea. How you relate to friends, how you recognize friends, how you maintain friendships, these are all wonderful ideas, particularly if you can focus on overcoming an initial reaction that may lead to an accentuation of dissimilarities. Go to any cafeteria in a major school and you're likely to see people sitting in ethnic groups. Now, why is this? It's largely because of similarity attraction. It's largely because of the way we perceive the other. So it begins with the implicit, immediate reaction to what the other looks like. Looks have an important role. It may seem very, very unfair, but physical appearance has a role both in friendship and romantic love. And it's a role that can be overcome over time, so as we get to know the personality of the other, but the initial importance of that can't be overstated. I believe that we should rethink the policy of multiculturalism and replace it with a policy that emphasizes commonalities. Because at the moment, what we are doing is highlighting, exaggerating, and even manufacturing group differences. So that's a first step that needs to happen at a policy level, and major institutions and even national level institutions need to rethink this policy. There's a lot wrong with the policy of multiculturalism, and we could talk about the psychological evidence underlying that statement. A second point I would make is that in practice, we could implement a number of programs that focus on superordinate categories and introduce these programs in schools, in universities, and get much more interaction and friendship across religious groups, ethnic groups, and other types of groups. But in order to implement such a program, bring in something like friendship projects, we need to have that broader discussion about what we are doing with multiculturalism. Because at the moment, if you introduce a friendship project, you're going to be actually working against multiculturalism, which is being pushed by so many other forces. We do have, at the moment, examples of superordinate goals, such as global environmental protection, etc. But I believe the most effective way of introducing superordinate goals is to start with people themselves, have discussions with people talking about their own goals, and when you do that, you quickly find that they have common goals. So it's not a difficult task. You can work bottom up to produce superordinate goals from different groups. Why do we have to have enemies at all? Why do we get into conflicts? Think about the wars we enter, the destructive wars that take up so much energy. Why can't we just focus on friendships and positive relationships? Well, psychologically, we would have to start with the position that human beings are not rational. A lot of their behavior is irrational. It's driven by implicit cognitive processes and instant reactions and emotions. This includes behavior at the international level, behavior relating nation to nation. So we should not really ask the question, why do we have enemies? Because the answer is very clear. We have enemies because we are irrational creatures. We are often driven by emotions that are leading us to destruction. And we sometimes fail to learn from history, and we repeat the same destructive lessons. For example, if we look at the history of the Middle East, it's clear that invasions of the Middle East have been associated with very bad outcomes. Go back to the 19th century, come forward to the 20th century and the 21st century, we keep repeating the same mistakes. Can we live just with friends? Well, first of all, it's essential to have friends because as human beings, we need to have others who we can trust. Our sense of safety depends on that, and having a few friends satisfies that sense of safety and sense of privacy. Friends are not just people we trust, they are people who are private with us. We can tell them our secrets. So there is an enclosed, safe world where we and our friends inhabit a small space. That's very important. Unfortunately, part of our current psychology is that friendship thrives particularly when we have a mechanism for displacing aggression. Friends often spend time gossiping about others and displacing their frustrations onto others. What happens at the interpersonal level also happens at the intergroup and national levels. We know that when there is unemployment, when there is perceptions of threat, when we feel that we are in decline, when our culture and language we feel is in decline, when our way of life seems to be threatened, one way to deal with this is to pick on an enemy. And that enemy is a threat that helps us to mobilize our resources. We know that in times of war, national leaders become much more positively evaluated. Their ratings go up. Conflict leads to support for the leader. So unfortunately, this idea of displacement of aggression is a very powerful mechanism that impacts not just our friendships, but our tendency to want to have enemies. Freud got a lot of things wrong in his psychology, but I believe he got one thing right when he said, we can combine people together in love as long as there are some left over to hate. Relationship between love and hate has been present historically. The question is, can we, with our modern technologies, manage to change this relationship so that we no longer need an enemy to hate? So that religions around the world can get on with each other, seeing their commonalities and not requiring an outgroup, that other religion, to hate. One key component is constructive leadership. And this is exceptional, it's rare. In most cases, leaders will take advantage of the situation and mobilize people around themselves using an enemy. They will identify enemies, they will identify threats. And if you listen to extremist radio stations, left and right, they will do the same. If you listen to them, they are highlighting the threat from the other. And that's how they get their supporters. Their supporters are high on authoritarianism, high on Machiavellianism, intolerable towards differences, intolerant of differences. So they have certain psychological characteristics, and they gather around these leaders who will focus on the enemy. Very few leaders can manage to get out of this cycle. Mandela is an example of a modern leader who managed to get out of that. He led the anti-apartheid movement, but at the end of it, he said, look, we now have to become one South Africa. that kind of ability is very rare. He also, by the way, was very important in setting term limits for the presidency. Another exceptional leader on this is George Washington. You know, he said, I don't want to be king. I'm going to set term limits. This is what we're going to do. We are one nation, and etc. Now, unfortunately, to get that kind of leader, you have to be very fortunate, right? You have to be lucky, historically. Another component, though, apart from the leadership, is an education system that focuses on commonality of human values and teaches children about the basic values that are human. And I believe we can do this based on certain principles that have evolved. Let me give you an example. In all human communications, there's a very important event that takes place. It's called turn-taking. It doesn't matter what language you're using. It doesn't matter if you're using nonverbal communications. If you do not turn-take, you can't communicate. In turn-taking, each of us has a right and a duty. I have a right to my turn to speak, but I have a duty to listen to you when you speak. If you have a question, I have a duty to listen and respond. Now, turn-taking is something that evolved through our evolution. Millions of years ago, when we didn't have language, we developed actions that involve turn-taking. You can see this in animals right now. Turn-taking in feeding, turn-taking in grooming. You can see turn-taking in traffic. It doesn't matter if there's a red light or not, we get to a stop sign and we turn-take. You can see this in more complex ways in the law courts. We take turns to provide evidence, cross-examine, turn-taking in politics, in debates. Term limits impose turn-taking. So that very basic rule of turn-taking is common to all humans. And it's an example of the kind of things that involves values, involves rights, involves duties, and as a human characteristic. It's not peculiar to Muslims or Jews or Christians. All of us have this. And all of us recognize immediately when somebody breaks a turn. And if you go to a playground, one of the first things that children learn is, he took my turn. It's not fair. So we can build on these kinds of commonalities as a starting point. Intergroup friendship and avoid destructive conflict between groups by having leaders who emphasize the commonalities, the superordinate goals, what all human beings share, and also encourage values in their own society that emphasize, again, commonalities between people, what we all share. The destructive leader is the one who is focusing, highlighting, manufacturing differences between groups and pointing to threats from the other all the time.